Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next iteration of Brains Blog Roundtables. My name is Dan Burston, and I'm the co-managing editor of the Brains Blog, along with Nick Bird. This is I think this is the fifth Brains Blog Roundtable, and I'm very excited for the panel discussion today. So the topic for today is Buddhism and philosophy of mind. So this is a topic that I'm really excited to learn more about. It's not something I'm an expert on, and we've got a really distinguished and excellent set of panelists today to talk with. So one reason why this topic is so interesting is because I think to some degree, I mean, people have always known it, but to some degree there's been a discovery of just how rich the philosophy of mind resources are in Buddhist theorizing about the mind. There's many, many issues about the nature of the self, the nature of perception, the moral emotions, about which there's this long, many hundreds of years of history of theorizing about within kind of Buddhist philosophy. And it's all very interesting and relevant, I think, to thinking about current issues in philosophy of mind. But it imposes a challenge, right? Because one has to do comparative philosophy to some degree. One has to be conversant in the primary text in order to understand the relevance and the upshot of these historical and cross-cultural materials for the way we do philosophy of mind and even some empirical psychology these days. So there's a ton of really rich intersection points between these literatures, and I'm excited to talk with our panelists today about how some of those intersections work and what opportunities there might be for philosophers and scientists to really learn from these interacting traditions. So we're going to get into all of that today. I'm very happy to introduce our panelists. I've taken, for no reason, to doing this counterclockwise on my screen. So that's the order in which I'm going to do this. So first up, by that arbitrary rubric, is Monima Chadha, who is an associate professor in the philosophy department at Monash University in Melbourne. Monima has worked on an extensive set of topics precisely kind of at this intersection, as I read it, of Buddhist philosophy and contemporary philosophy of mind, including on perception, on the self and agency, a little bit of work on the metaphysics of mind as well. And Monima has published papers in these areas in top journals in the field: Australasian Journal of Philosophy, Philosophy East and West, and Mind and Language. So Monima is the leader of two current research projects, if I read this correctly: Responsibility Without Unified Agency, and Selfless Minds, a cross-cultural theory with relevance for mindfulness. So already in there is a huge amount of fascinating stuff to bring to the table. So very happy to have you, Monima. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next up is Owen Thompson, who is a professor in the philosophy department at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So Owen has made important contributions both to the philosophy of cognitive science and the philosophy of biology. I think of him as kind of a pioneer in embodied and inactive approaches to cognitive science, as well as the life-mind continuity thesis. Owen's work draws on a wide range of things, including the phenomenological tradition, biology and cognitive science, as well as neuroscience. He's also contributed significantly to public and philosophical discourse about Buddhism specifically. And among his books are his 2007 Mind in Life, his 2015 book Waking, Dreaming, and Being, and his 2020 book Why I Am Not a Buddhist, which probably will come up at times during the course of conversation today. So very happy to have you here, Owen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
And last but certainly not least, we have Owen Flanagan, who is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor in Philosophy at Duke University. Owen similarly has a very wide range of work across many issues in philosophy of mind, including prominently on the nature of consciousness, philosophy of neuroscience, some work on addiction, which I teach to my undergrad students in my phil neuro classes, but also on moral psychology, in particular the moral emotions, as well as in Buddhism and comparative philosophy. So among his numerous books are the 2011 The Bodhisattva's Brain, Buddhism Naturalized, which is certainly relevant for today, with MIT Press, and his most recent book, How to Do Things with Emotions, Anger and Shame Across Cultures, was published last year, I believe, by Princeton University Press. So very excited to have you here, Owen. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me too.
Yeah, great. All right, so really excited to get going for today. I wanted to start out just by having each of you give a little bit of an introduction to some of your current research. Obviously, you all have these huge research profiles, so a little bit about maybe what you're working on currently and why you're finding that to be interesting and exciting work to do. So why don't we just go in the same order? So Monima, do you mind getting us started?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So you've picked up on both of my projects that I'm currently working on. So the Selfless Minds is coming out as a book with OUP. It's almost in the final stages, if I may say so. So, and in there, I'm looking mostly at Vasubandhu's text. So Vasubandhu is a figure in 4th, 5th century BC in India. I'm sorry, AD in India, and Indian philosopher in that time. And he is the most important. Abhidharma is one of the traditions. So if I might say a little bit, just very quickly about, the 3 important traditions in Buddhist philosophy. So I like to think of the first, texts, the sutras as they are called. They are the Nikayas, apparently the word of the Buddha, or dialogues that, have been written by disciples at a later time. Then there's the Abhidharma tradition. And then, at the same time, there is another tradition that started in India, which is the Mahayana or the Madhyamika tradition. So those are the 3 important traditions. And Vasubandhu, the philosopher I've been working on for the book, is part of the Abhidharma. He's the most important protagonist, I think, in the Abhidharma tradition. He wrote this text, the Abhidharma Kosha, Bhashya, which Abhidharma Kosh means, the important doctrines of the Abhidharma schools, and Bhashya is his commentary on those. So for the book, I was looking closely at his argument for no self. The one thing I realized while I was working through the text is that Vasubandhu gives the same treatment for selves and persons, exactly the same treatment. There's a lot of talk about selves not being ultimately real in Buddhist philosophy and persons being conventionally real. But when you look at Vasubandhu's text, he says both selves and persons are conventionally real. And so he affords the same treatment to both of them. And that made me think, that there is something about, we've come to believe that conventional persons are useful fictions and, everything is all right with practices about moral responsibility and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to pursue this line a little further and ask, what if we have no selves and no persons to do any real work? So it not just, has implications for philosophy of mind, how we think of a selfless philosophy of mind, but how we think of our person-related practices, especially moral responsibility. And that's my second project. Moral responsibility without a unified self is also moral responsibility in Vasubandhu's sense, without persons as well, because most people think that's why persons are introduced in Buddhist philosophy. I'd like to hear what others think about this, but that's the 2 projects I'm doing.
Awesome, fantastic. Yeah, we're definitely gonna come back to this at several points in the conversation. But yeah, I was just really obvious, like rich connection to a lot of things that people think about agency and moral responsibility and so forth. So yeah, that's really exciting. And I apologize, I didn't realize you had a book forthcoming. I would have given it a plug, but
It's totally fine.
Good. So that's really great. Thanks so much, and looking forward to chatting more about some of these things. Evan, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So I work, I suppose, on a number of different things in parallel, and Buddhist philosophy kind of flows in and out of them in different ways. But excuse me, I have a scratchy throat. But the main project I'm working on now is a book on death and dying. And the premise of the book is that we're in this peculiar cultural situation where we've never known as much as we know about the biomedical facts pertaining to the death of the organism, while at the same time, never have we been so paralyzed by the fact of death and removed from it, unlike, you know, virtually every other culture throughout history. And so I'm really interested in what the evolving work in neuroscience about what happens to the brain in dying and death tells us about consciousness, particularly in the phases of dying. And I'm very interested in what ancient philosophical traditions, including Buddhism, but not exclusively Buddhism, tell us about the importance of life seen, you know, in relationship to the inevitability of death, and particularly, you could say, contemplative philosophical perspectives that urge us to, you know, reframe our life and our orientation towards death in a contemplative way. So Buddhism is certainly an example of that, but there are, of course, other traditions like Stoicism, and in some sense, every tradition of philosophy in the ancient world was oriented this way. It's a peculiarity of modern philosophy that we don't really think that we think of this as like a subtopic in philosophy, not actually what philosophy altogether should be concerned with. So I'm interested in kind of revitalizing that ancient sensibility in philosophy, and Buddhism is very important for that, particularly because of the way it thinks about the nature of consciousness and death in light of the absence of an enduring self, and relating that to our, you know, ever-growing knowledge of what happens to the brain and to the, you know, the rest of the organism and person at death. So that book is still in its early stages, but that's, you know, what I foresee I'm going to be working mainly on for the next couple of years.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really, really cool. I mean, one of the things that I you know, kept coming up against as I started, you know, researching for this panel is sort of like, you get deep enough into this, and it does become a kind of life philosophy very quickly, right? And that's something that we really don't do in contemporary academic philosophy very frequently. So that is something I definitely want to come back to as well. And of course, Owen, this is relevant to your work as well, having worked on things like neuroexistentialism and so forth. So anyway, do you want to tell us a little bit about what?
I'm first of all just happy to be with colleagues who really do appreciate in a deep way the value of these many ancient philosophical traditions. And I think this is one gift of comparative or cross-cultural philosophy. So let me relate my most recent finished project and then my upcoming one too, specifically to resources inside Buddhist philosophy, which I think are helpful. So the project I just finished, the book that just came out this past December, How to Do Things with the Emotions, is actually a response to what I took to be a sort of a problem inside both American, you know, North Atlantic or North American philosophy of mind, theories in psychology about the emotions, and social life, which is simply this: that I've never lived in angrier times. I've lived, you know, in the late 60s and early 70s, when there was feminism and civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement and the Stonewall uprising in Greenwich Village. But there was terrible tragedy. But there was a kind of anger, a righteous anger with optimism. And what I started to feel around me was a kind of infantile anger, seething, no longer ability to talk with each other across political and social divides. And I started to think, well, what could help us out of this? And I thought, this is again a case where sometimes when you have trouble, you can look to other traditions for theorizing about your problems. And of course, Evan has already mentioned, he mentioned Stoicism. So in both the new book called How to Do Things with the Emotions, I basically tried to sort of revisit theories of emotions, some of which take emotions to just be like reflexes or knee jerks and pupil contractions to light, and then thought about the great traditions in Stoicism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, which have us think about cultivating emotions in different ways. And I also read the psychology, the cultural psychology and anthropology of the two emotions I take up, anger and shame. and was struck immediately with how completely differently people do these particular emotions across cultures. So they're what I call normative and scripted, and they're often normed and scripted in alignment with certain cultural values, including the values of how you do the emotions. So Buddhism is a great resource there, of course, and I write a fair amount in both this book and my previous book, Geography of Morals, about Buddhist contributions to these debates about how to do the emotions. So I continue to work on the emotions, and my most recent project is continuing with what probably isn't an emotion, but is important, which is happiness. And so Joe Ledoux and I are writing a book together with a team of people called The Happiness Agenda. Subtitle is Happiness is Not the Answer. And we're a team, and basically what we're doing is trying to sort of treat as a simple fad, a poorly theorized fad, the idea that happiness is the summum bonum, which some people say, well, Aristotle said that. Well, no, he didn't. In any case, what we're doing there is sort of really taking on an industry, and we're reminding people, for example, again, of resources in Buddhism. Many people will say, I don't know if Monima and Evan will agree with me, but in the late 80s, the Dalai Lama wrote a book with Howard Cutler, a psychiatrist, Kurtzer, I guess his name, called The Art of Happiness. And it led to a kind of a surge of interest among some people I think Evan and I at least know well, good friends of ours, who've been encouraged to sort of think about happiness as a route to, as Buddhism as a route to happiness. But this goes against certain strands in Buddhism, which traditionally say unsatisfactoriness and unhappiness are the problem. We can maybe help you get through those. Happiness, maybe that's a different thing, and it might be a superficial thing. So these are ways in which, even as I work on the more different moral emotions or different goods in life, I'm blending in my interest in Buddhism along the way.
Awesome, cool, thanks. That's really exciting. Joseph Ledoux is one of the very famous neuroscientists of the emotions. So that's a really fun collaboration, and it again points up the richness of the potential interactions here between different fields. Great. Okay, so I want to dive into all of this. So let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to kind of start out with a pretty broad question, almost maybe methodological, and that is just in terms of what Buddhism is offering or so forth. It's often kind of proposed that Buddhism contains a kind of self-enclosed philosophy of mind. I think some have even offered that it has insights for empirical psychology and maybe even neuroscience and so forth. So I wanted to start out just by asking, sort of, as contemporary philosophers interested in contemporary philosophy of mind and psychology, are there kind of new like methodological avenues opened up, or are there new kind of theoretical approaches that are informed by learning more about Buddhist views of the mind? So I'm going to ask for each question someone to get us started, but then hopefully everyone will chime in. Evan, do you mind getting us going on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I would approach that question, if we're thinking of it methodologically, I would approach that question, let's say, from the perspective of cognitive science as a field and as a discipline, where cognitive science includes philosophy, has always defined itself as including philosophy of mind. And historically, what that has meant is European and North American philosophy, particularly, thinkers like Descartes and Locke and Hume and Kant, thinkers concerned with mental representations. And that has, some cognitive scientists and philosophers have been very explicit about this, like Jerry Fodor, for example. The philosophy then that has shaped the evolution and orientation of cognitive science has been a particular philosophical tradition, and it has strengths and weaknesses. But if we're really concerned to understand the nature of the mind, then it's very important to have a cross-cultural approach and to recognize that there are other philosophical traditions that have very sophisticated, theoretical models and theoretical vocabularies with different assumptions, different starting places, different arguments, different inferences, And those can actually be very important for cognitive science, both to be reflectively critical of its own assumptions and also to open up new avenues of investigation. So, I mean, one way to put it is to say that cognitive science, in order to live up to its own aspirations, really needs to be cross-cultural. And that means that, developed philosophical traditions like Buddhism, but not just Buddhism, I would also say, Brahminical philosophy, Jain philosophy, traditions in Chinese philosophy. We need to take advantage of the resources of the history of world philosophy and thinking about the mind. So that would be a very general answer. If we wanted to get more specific, then I would say there are a number of topics and phenomena where Buddhism in particular is relevant. So if we're trying to understand mental functions or capacities like attention or metacognition or meta-awareness, then Buddhism has some very developed ways of thinking about how these work, and that are linked to various kinds of, you could say, self-cultivation or mental training practices. The word we use in our culture is meditation. That's something of a problematic word, but I mean, we can use that word for our purposes if we like. So there's a sophisticated theoretical philosophical discourse around these mental capacities, and then there are various kinds of practices that are important as sources of data and also as ways of thinking about how these practices actually work in action. So that would be one example. Another example is, and so Owen has written a lot about this, is how cognitive science was formed with a very strong cognition-emotion divide or cognition-emotion distinction. And as neuroscience has evolved, as cognitive science has evolved, it's become, increasingly clear that that distinction doesn't really work. Any process in the brain that's cognitive is also affective. Any, function that's cognitive is also affectively constituted. So it's interesting that this, distinction between cognition and emotion reflects an older distinction between reason and passion and so on, which we don't see at all in Buddhist philosophy. We don't really see it in Indian philosophy. We see different maps of the mind, different models of the mind, in which there is no cognition here, emotion here. There are mental functions that are cognitive and that are affective, and that get categorized in a different way. They also get categorized normatively in terms of, whether they're neutral, whether they're beneficial, or whether they're harmful. And that's important too, because we forget the hidden normativity in our own mental, typologies. So those are some kind of general methodological reasons with relationship to some, specific concrete phenomena that I think make other philosophical traditions and Buddhist philosophy in particular relevant for cognitive science and for philosophy of mind in general.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a ton to dive into in there, some of which we'll come back. Monima, Owen, do you want to add anything? Yeah, Monima, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with Evan, that one of the things is, the cognition emotion divide, as if they're separate, is totally non-existent to my knowledge in Indian philosophy. They don't just think of them as separate. The only other thing, because of my obsession with the self, I'll add, is that the Buddhist philosophers in particular, you want to think of a philosophy of mind without a role for a conscious executive self. There are a whole lot of processes, mental processes and physical processes that are going on, and functions of these is enough to explain what the mind does. We do not need, there is no need, or at least I argue, there's no need for self-representations or a conscious executive self, to play the role of, keeping everything in control. It has a life of its own. The mind has a life of its own, to borrow from Evan.
Yeah, that's a terrific. Both my colleagues, I just to add a little bit to it. So I think, one of the wonderful things about looking at something like Buddhist philosophy, for reasons that both Monima and Evan said, is that, it goes like Niels Bohr, I think, was the one who said that yesterday's science is today's common sense. And just reading back what sort of Evan said about the foundations of cognitive science, you know, what you really started with there was a very, very parochial, but very interesting and very powerful model of the mind as divided into faculties with the I, the sort of an I, the executive I that Monima was just talking about, which allegedly was something you could obviously introspect. And so it's not, you know, given that, as it were, cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience almost always starts with surmises at the level of psychology or phenomenology, then that means that what we take for granted as the right psychological model we'll keep looking for it forever and ever. Now, what's wonderful about looking at a different tradition is to say, really? They didn't see the self? Or, you know, in fact, an amusing story. I've been doing work with the Vatican for the last few years. It's the work I'm doing has to do with ethics and models of, but it relates to models of the mind. And I was at a conference just 3 weeks ago where some psychologists in the room said to a very, very senior and wise Catholic cardinal philosopher, he's an expert on Aristotle and Aquinas, we in psychology don't make that reason emotions distinction anymore. He said, but you must. It's the essence of philosophical anthropology. And I knew what he meant. He meant that Plato had said that there's a charioteer and 2 horses. Aristotle had picked it up in a little bit less anthropomorphic form. It hit Aquinas, and now it is the way we must look at things. And it wasn't his job to be doing what we're doing, but the point was, I just thought, gosh, what liberation one gets, though, when one goes to another also very serious tradition of philosophical psychology. You start to get these different models, and then they don't constrain the search for what's going to implement or be the substratum in the same way at all. One other example I'll give is, this doesn't relate to huge, big models of mine, but when I got interested in anger, I thought, what does psychology books say about anger? And so you just pick up any psychology book, and every psychology book will tell you that anger is an approach emotion. And if you ask any American, they'll say, yeah, I want to punch you in the nose. I want to hit. That's what they want to do. They don't do it, luckily. But as soon as you start to do cross-cultural work, you'll find out, for example, that in Japan, it's an avoidance emotion. The basic impulse is I want to leave the room. Now, these aren't maybe deeply embedded with philosophical roots in the ground, but they point to immediate differences in how you should think about taxonomizing things that you take for granted.
Yeah, I think this is all such a deep point about how kind of like deep down our philosophical training gets when we think about even what the theoretical possibilities are. So I've been working on the neuroscience of decision making and action control, and just becoming more and more convinced that this kind of homuncular picture with a self-conscious executive at the top of some hierarchy just doesn't match the science at all. So, I mean, it's interesting maybe I would have realized this years ago if I'd been more schooled in comparative philosophy and so forth.
But who's holding the reins on the 2 horses?
Yeah, I know, right? That's, the reins got to be in here somewhere. And, yeah, so this is really, really exciting to me. And it, I think it's so great when we can kind of diagnose and assess our own philosophical predilections as driving so much of the way that people theorize about things. That's really, really a fantastic set of points. Good. Okay. So let's dive into some specific issues. So one thing I wanted to talk about, and we could have done reason and emotion. We could have done any number of things. Maybe this is selfishness. One of the things I'm really interested in is the perception cognition distinction and the distinction between percepts and concepts. It's a pretty major topic and has been for a long time, but it's seeing a resurgence right now in philosophy of psychology and philosophy of perception. But this, of course, there's a long history of theorizing about this within Buddhist accounts of perception and epistemology. So actually I wanted to ask, to what extent are the historical debates within Buddhist theorizing, are they the same debate as these kind of contemporary philosophical debates about, say, non-conceptual perceptual content? What are the points of intersection here? And I know that a couple of you have written on this, so wanted to maybe just selfishly get some insight here. So Monima, do you mind getting us started on this one?
Yeah, I'll start, but I know I've recently read one of Evans's new work on this, so I'm sure he'll join in. So the way I see it, yes, there is commonality between the issues. So one issue that the Buddhist and the Hindu debate in ancient India is concerned about is, realism versus nominalism about universals. The Hindus are realists about universals. They think things have real properties, and they really exist. They even think, those Nyaya philosophers, one of the Hindu traditions, they even think that universals can be perceived, which is not a common view in the Western traditions, at least. Whereas the Buddhists are the arch nominalists. So yes, there are some continuities in the tradition, and they face similar problems, the conceptual, non-conceptual, or the cognition perception divide in Buddhist philosophy, I think, is faced with the same issue as in the West. How do we get the scope of the non-conceptual or the conceptual right? How do we know what's conceptual and what's non-conceptual? Given that there is no settled notion of concepts, the minute you build in, I mean, the idea is, we are trying to think, is there's things and we want to categorize them. The minute you build in any discrimination within content or, what the world has in it, you get, something concept-like. So, people like McDowell come in and give you something as thin as, a demonstrative concept, that read, with that kind of specificity, which doesn't even require recognitional ability. Well, then there is a debate about whether that's a concept or not. That becomes the problem. If you don't build any discrimination into non-conceptual content, then you don't have content. You just have the world. You have a blob, right? Without any content. That's how I see it. And that debate, is there in the Western tradition and there in the Buddhist tradition. The Buddhists are very worried about, how to separate these. They want to build in sensory discrimination at the very early stages of sensory awareness, some notion of discrimination, and they want to call it non-conceptual, and then they later want to have a more, sort of more intellectualized notion or more sophisticated notion of concept to come later on, which has language and so on and so forth. But whether they succeed or not is a different issue to, separate out contents in this way. But the important thing, I've been thinking of working on this issue is to come at it, with thinking about what happens in meditation. So one of the things that happens in meditation, the Buddhists claim, and other people have been looking at least some attenuation of concepts. Some attenuation of concepts happen. What does that exactly mean? And, is that a way, sort of a backdoor entry into getting into, figuring out what this distinction might amount to? That said, I do want to say that, the non-conceptual sort of awareness that is available in very higher states of meditation is not something, that you think a child or an animal. I think it's a mistake to think that children or animals have non-conceptual cognition in the same sense. So, it's worth looking at this tradition to see, what they have to say about conceptual attenuation, how you have concepts and slowly peel them off, so to say. That's how I'm thinking about what might be happening. I'm sure, others will have more to say about that. But if we're thinking of peeling away structure slowly, then we might, it's at least a new route to get there. And it is, let me, not it is informed by Buddhist philosophy and their philosophical principles in general. Meditation is not something that you do, without, at least in the Indian Buddhist tradition. It's not something you do without having training in philosophy, without knowing about the scriptures, without, reasoning about them and thinking about them. So you come to meditation much, much later. And this kind of awareness is a product of that. So there might be things to worry about. It's just not sitting on the cushion and peeling away concepts. I'm certainly not suggesting that.
That's really cool, because it's very much the case in the current debate. You assume like some early stage of perception is non-conceptual, and then it's like a question of how much farther you can go, and virtually no one starts in the other direction. That's a really cool idea about how to potentially have the discussion differently. Yeah, that's really, really awesome. Evan, Owen, do you want to have anything to add on this, or?
Yeah, I can add some things. So this is actually something I've written a lot about recently. If people are interested in following up on some of my ideas, there's a paper you can find online called "What's in a Concept: Conceptualizing the Non-Conceptual in Buddhist Philosophy and Cognitive Science." And what I do in that paper is I look to a particular very important and influential philosopher in the Indian Buddhist tradition named Dharmakirti, who's hugely influential for subsequent Buddhist philosophy in India and in Tibet. And Dharmakirti comes out of a tradition of thinking in Buddhism that, as Monima said, is strongly nominalist, as opposed to the view that there are real universals. And what he does is he gives a theory of concept formation in a nominalistic universe, in a universe, conceived nominalistically. And the basic idea is that concept formation happens through the selective ignoring of differences. So he ties concept formation to attentional functions and to a kind of screening off perceptually of differences, because strictly speaking, for him as a nominalist, there are only causally efficacious particulars that are real, and every particular is strictly speaking unique. He's a kind of extreme trope theorist. And so then the question is, well, how do you get generalities? How do you get linguistically expressible generalities? How do you get categories? And his idea is that, well, everything is different from everything else. And so you screen off some of the differences that aren't relevant to your particular interests, which are, mainly have to do with tracking certain kinds of causal regularities, given that you have a certain kind of a body with certain, imprints and tendencies as a result of your history, which for him means, your karmic history. And so you sort of lump and you split. You lump things together, you split them off from other things, and then you mistakenly take them to be real. So sort of built into concept formation is reification, that you think your categories are real and reflect how things really are independently of the mind. And it should be said here that in terms of the debates about concepts in cognitive science, he has a kind of minimalist view of concepts. So perceptual recognition or perceptual type identification is sufficient for being conceptual for him. So re-identification of something over time, this shade of blue or this is blue, that is conceptual. And that's the basis for further complex forms of conceptualization that require language. So he says, for example, he says a concept is a mental image that's fitted to be associated with words. And what he means by a mental image is a kind of prototype mental structure that comes about through screening off differences and then reiterating this concept as if you're re-identifying something, in each moment, but actually, strictly speaking, you're not, because you're just sort of lumping different things together. And that image is then suited to be associated with the generality of words. And so he says, that infants and animals, they orient perceptually to kinds or types. The baby goes to the breast to feed. And so that's conceptual already for him because it's recognitional, even though they don't have language. So he's very clear that you don't need language for concepts. What you need are recognitional abilities. Now, the interesting twist on this is that sensation or pure sense experience then for him is non-conceptual. But he also thinks that we hardly ever experience that. because everything in our experience is already shot through with categorization and conceptualization. So there's a way in which he agrees with the conceptualists in Western philosophy who say, you know, you don't experience anything unless it's brought under a concept. And he would say, yes, in a sense, that's true, but you're bringing something under a concept nonetheless depends on this non-conceptual sense perception. And to make it even more interesting, he thinks that non-conceptual sense perception has built into it an inherent distortion in the unenlightened or unawakened mind, which is the subject-object structure, what we would call the subject-object structure of phenomenal intentionality. This idea that, you know, there is an I that is here perceiving, you know, an object that endures through time over there. So the enduring object, the enduring subject, he says that's actually not conceptual. That's already built into sense experience non-conceptually. And then conceptualization rides on that because you need that subject-object structure in order to form these kinds of stable recognitional categories, either internally, introspectively, or externally. So the great thing about this tradition of what is usually called Buddhist epistemology is that it has an incredibly detailed theory of what concepts are, of what concept formation is, but with unique moves that are different from our moves, and that also open up the possibility in the conceptual non-conceptual debate of a different kind of non-conceptual experience than it is talked about in our debates, which is precisely experience that would be free of the subject-object structure. If you have a mode, so this connects to what Monima was saying about certain kinds of meditative practices and experiences, if you have a mode of experience in which the subject-object structure drops away, that mode of experience must be non-conceptual, according to this way of thinking about concepts. And that then becomes a different possibility in the space of thinking about, you know, what non-conceptuality could be as we have discussed it. You know, some Western thinkers have pointed to this in things like flow states or certain kinds of, you know, embodied skillful action that's absorbed that doesn't seem to have a subject-object structure. So it's not like this idea is completely foreign to us, but it's much, much more developed and elaborated in the Indian context and in the subsequent Tibetan commentarial traditions. So it's an incredibly rich area. So for anybody interested in concepts and, you know, the perception cognition issue in cognitive science, I strongly encourage them to go, you know, look at Dharmakirti and what he's got to say about these things. And there's some, you know, good secondary sources that make that possible now.
Awesome. Owen, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a quick addition to fascinating discussions by both Monima and Evan. This is not, what I'm about to say is not about the conceptual, non-conceptual content issue, but about another view internal to Buddhism, even to Buddhist modernism, which has to do with cognitive penetrability. This is again, you know, we have these models. I mean, one of the greatest books in the history of cognitive science, because of its clarity, is Jerry Fodor's Modularity of Mind. I mean, it's just a wonderful way of systematizing. Okay, look at, here's how this is, as Fodor would say. And I mean, this was the mother's milk. And when Evan and I were coming up in cognitive science, you of course had to read the Modularity of Mind. But you know, but there's so much that comes from a certain philosophical tradition. I mean, it's a faculty psychology. Okay, assuming Fodor isn't insisting that these modules have to be literally physically modularized, the general point seems plausible first pass, right? Look at, vision takes in its own proprietary kind of input, light. My ears don't take in light. My ears take in something else, sound waves, we'll call them. My taste buds do something different. The tactile kinesthetic system seems to have a different stimuli. And then we know how the story goes. These things sort of, the inputs are mandatory, they're sent upward, and cognition can't keep them down. That's sort of a standard view, and that's the cognitive impenetrability idea. And what you see right out of the gate, just by paying attention to what other traditions will tell you, you see this in the Confucian self-cultivation tradition, but you also see it in Hindu yoga practices and in Buddhist practices. that they basically say, no, I can control that. I mean, sort of classical examples. Sometimes these are master meditators, but someone Evan and I know, I remember when Matthieu Ricard was taken by Paul Ekman and, to be studied, and they would say things like, okay, we're going to count backwards from 10, and when we get to 1, you're going to hear a sound as loud as a gunshot. And apparently everybody, allegedly, that's cognitively impenetrable. Even if you know and have a warning, you can't help but have the reflex of, and heart rate goes up and stuff. Well, allegedly, we'll suppose it's true, Matthieu Ricard stayed at normal when the sound went off. And, so a lot of the stuff in mind-body medicine has to do with possibilities for, well, I'm going to call it cognitive control because that's the vocabulary I have, because I don't have a better one, but some kind of me as a full-on living organism can do these complicated, interesting, reflexive things to myself and by myself, even though, as it were, I don't have one of those. And so we stumble to articulate what is going on here because we have one certain proprietary vocabulary. But anyway, I think that's an area, the cognitive penetration issue is one, again, where there's real value to engaging with the self by itself, small s itself.
Awesome. Yeah, that was really enlightening. And you see like a bunch of ways in there in which, so the issue of like perceptual learning comes up in there, but it's construed a particular way. A lot of people are now writing about perceptual learning and perceptual expertise as the result of training in some of these current debates. But also like the idea of control and how certain practices might enable us to think about concepts in a particular way, or think about control of perception in a particular way. I mean, I think this just really does a good job pointing out how rich the kind of and multifaceted the intersections are with the different traditions in the current debate. I'll have to think about, I didn't actually know about the self-object distinction being built into the non-conceptual content, because a lot of times people take that as like almost the sine qua non of conceptual content. You introduce that objectivity move like through the application of concepts. So I will definitely have to go look into that a little further. Really, really cool. Great. Okay, so we could go on with that all day. At least I could. But but I want to keep moving on the outline here. So and specifically, there's a couple more big things I really want to make sure we get to. So I want to talk about moral psychology a little bit and the moral emotions. So I think a very obvious connection, and Owen has brought this out a couple times already, is thinking about the moral emotions in Buddhism. So thinking about the role of emotions in our lives. Certainly things like suffering and desire are inherent parts of Buddhist philosophy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about theorizing in moral psychology and what ways we might this might be affected, particularly by Buddhist traditions. So Owen, we're kind of already primed for it. You want to get us started here?
Sure. Yeah. Again, this is just a treasure trove of resources for thinking about alternative possibilities. As I say, my sort of general way of trying to introduce students or readers sometimes to this topic is to say, we all care about such things as, we will say, emotional balance and harmony in our soul. And sometimes we will have reason to think that we as an individual have some problems with calibrating something or other. Maybe we, for example, in terms of recent cultural, first there are bad role models about anger because people act like it's just perfectly appropriate to get angry and spew venom at your opponents. That's one thing. So the kids learn that. And people don't seem to be sensitive about the fact that at least some of their angry displays are what Martha Nussbaum and other people, I call them this too, involve pain passing, so that they are, you hurt me, I'm going to get you right on back. Or another kind of anger that's at least common in precincts where I live is there's a ventilationist view of anger, which goes like this. It was sort of came from primal scream therapy in the 60s, I think. But the idea is that it's very important to get your emotions out. And if I'm unhappy and Evan's in the room with me, he might have to suffer my anger, not because he did anything wrong, just because I'm pissy and there's a ventilationist view that I ought to express how I feel. Well, I think that's a disaster for reasons that we can't go into here. But then the question would be, well, what kind of sort of therapy of desire could one do in order to think better about how to do one's emotional self? And here, Buddhism is a wonderful resource. First of all, its first ethical commands, insofar as that there are such things, are that you should feel compassion for all sentient beings. And what is compassion other than not wanting other sentient beings to suffer? So the desire to repay hurt with hurt is a desire that goes against the sort of ethical aspects of the moral psychology of Buddhism. The other thing about anger that Buddhism really helps theorize, Stoicism is good on this too, is that in what's called the Four Noble Truths, the first truth is roughly that there's suffering and unsatisfactoriness all over the place. Some of the suffering, we might say, I'm being a Buddhist modernist here, is caused by things like germs and cancer, acts of God, as we would say. But other kinds of suffering are caused by our ego. The fact that we think that somehow the cosmos was created and invented for our sake. So that, when we get in a long line at the coffee shop and the person in front of us orders a triple macchiato with virgin coconut shavings from the Bahamas and wants to pay by a check, and we're behind them, we go, oh my God, the fucking guy ruined my day. I can't believe he did this to me. And then, the person's friends console her. There's something wrong there. The cosmos, and of course the Stoics had that you should study astronomy to get over yourself in this way. But Buddhism also is filled with admonitions to get out of your own way. And of course, Monima will have much more to say about this that's sophisticated about texts. But the idea, at that point, we haven't yet said you don't have a self, but what the Buddhism still will sure entitle us to say is that you should want to get out of your own way. And one of the ways to get out of your own way is to think that every one of your desires ought to be satisfied.
Yeah.
When you satisfy your desires, then it'll become old hat. You'll just go on to the next thing. You'll get on a hedonic treadmill. So the Buddhists sort of theorizing about how anger could be bad for you individually, for your own getting over suffering and unsatisfactoriness, and how much being less angry, at least unless it's about righteous causes, would do for your interpersonal relationship, I think is just exactly the kind of advice we need right now. So I'll leave it there with anger.
Yeah. Cool. Either of you, Monima, or Evan, want to jump in?
I'll just say one thing. I've been, what they say in the Buddhist texts about anger is one of the upakaleshas. Kalesha is something which is a negative affliction that we need to get rid of. So we need to get rid of anger completely. It stems from hatred. That's what Vasubandhu says. That's the guy I read most these days. It stems from hatred and leads to all sorts of things like enmity and, horrible actions. So we need to get rid of. But then I worry, what do we do about righteous anger? That's the kind of puzzle I've been thinking about, and I've been looking at other stories, the kind of anthropology, if you like, the Bodhisattva stories, whether blame is often used at all. Does the Bodhisattva get angry? Does he blame? And how do they, deal with that? And it seems like there is room for righteous anger within Buddhism. But I think, that's the puzzle I find kind of most interesting. We can't rule out anger wholesale. We need to keep it under control, surely, I agree with that, but ruling out wholesale anger means we can't get angry at Trump and others. That would be a disaster on the other side. So, how do we, I think more work needs to be done to get this right. If we are getting the Buddhist philosophy to inform what, how to deal, how to think about anger.
By the way, I do 100% agree with what you're saying. And there is some good work being done, including by one of my current graduate students on both a classical text in Theravada, of which he knows the right languages, and also even in Shantideva, which can help with there is in both, I think what Monima is bringing up, and this is an important caution, not that any of us in this room are like this. It isn't like you go to Buddhism to find all the right answers. It's a historical tradition like all other traditions. Mistakes were made and social conditions vary. So I think what's pretty clear about both Stoicism and Buddhism, both of which look sometimes, according to certain texts, like totally limitedness about anger, is that that's not going to work for us, because we do have good reasons to think there are some kinds of anger which at least that we need. And actually the student of mine who's looking at this finds that Seneca in his essay, the Stoic Seneca in his essay on anger, points out, I think he says this, he says, the Greeks have like 35 words, we only have 25. And what my student is noticing is how many of these different anger words have different, apply to different situations. He's also seeing the same thing there, that not every kind of anger is required to be eliminated, but that remains to be seen. Yeah, thank you for that comment. It's very helpful.
This is something actually that I think it might be useful to think about from the point of view of teaching for those who watch this, who teach philosophy. Last semester, I taught a course called Comparative Conceptions of the Self. And I had my students read Shantideva, and then I had them read some writings by philosophers today, including some of Owen's writings and Martha Nussbaum and Misha Cherry on anger. And I set them the paper topic, is Shantideva right that anger is always bad? And I had one student write an absolutely brilliant paper. And what she basically argued, she said, look, Shantideva understands anger as arising out of hatred or ill will, where you're faced with something that's an obstacle to your sense of self, and you want to remove the impediment by causing harm to it. And if that's what we understand by anger, then yes, Deva is right, it's inherently bad. But we need to distinguish that from moral outrage or from indignation in the face of wrong. And she made the argument that, for example, all of Misha Cherry's arguments in favor of anger could be restated as arguments in favor of indignation and be made compatible with, Shantideva's views about anger. And my point is, not that that's necessarily the right or the wrong position to take. I mean, this is an area that's, a very interesting one for discussion, but it's a good example of how we need to, bring these texts to life in our own context, these, historical Buddhist texts, and how when we give them to our students, they can really do some very creative things with them. And I was really impressed by this paper and this argument. And I think it's an example of how the next generation, the generation that we're teaching, is really going to be doing philosophy in a different way because these traditions are being made available to them.
Yeah, in a sense, just having, even as a dialectical contrast, the idea that all anger is bad makes you sort of look for alternative positions in the middle ground and so forth, right? So just having the contrast there really is philosophically helpful. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I also like how this kind of just immediately brings up the normativity of the emotions and the cognitive theorizing that goes around with them, right? So when it's appropriate to have these certain, if at all, to have these kinds of feelings and so forth, right? And yeah, certainly very so relevant to our current our current situations. So, okay, cool, great. Let's do a little bit on the self. So, couldn't do a panel on Buddhism without it. So, So the no self view, the view that there is no substantive self, is, arguably one of the most famous views that emerges from Buddhism. So if you take a Buddhism 101 class, that's one of the views I think that you're going to learn. But what's interesting to me is that some people, Monima, I think I would include you in this as well, have started looking at this view partially in light of results from empirical psychology, and almost kind of putting this view in contact with certain views in psychology and philosophy of mind. So can you say a little more, and Monima, I was going to ask you to get started on this, can you say a little more about like how the traditional no self view intersects with philosophical conceptions of, say, identity, and maybe for everyone, whether or not it's the kind of thing we can even assess with empirical findings?
So here's, something where I'd start thinking first about how it intersects with philosophy. So there was a distinction that P.F. Strawson made between descriptive philosophy and revisionary philosophy. Descriptive philosophy is just, describing the conceptual structure or the conceptual framework that we use, and not doing anything more. And he had philosophers in mind, when he was thinking about revisionary metaphysics. That was people like Hegel, Descartes. He named them as people doing revisionary metaphysics. Now, these days, we think of, the scientists are doing the revisionary metaphysics. They're telling us how we should really think about the world, not how not how common sense thinks about it. And so I use that contrast to think about Buddhist metaphysics as kind of a revisionary metaphysics. And it's not just about, the no-self view is not just about, a different metaphysical view. It also suggests how we need to change revise our practices in accordance with the no-self view. And I think because most people in contemporary philosophy who are interested in Buddhism kind of take it for granted that the notion of person is available in Buddhist philosophy. There is conventional persons, that idea is available. And so we can do all the work that is needed for our practices, moral responsibility, and so on, by using that notion of person. So we don't need to change anything here. We just go on as normal. We just think about this no-self view, in epistemology, and that might be a challenge, but we can get over. But I think, if we take the no self and no person view, which I think at least one Buddhist philosopher put forward, then we can really see the force of the revisionary metaphysics. So, they also want us to change our practices. They did not have a market economy, for example. I mean, one of the startling consequences of this would be the Buddhists. I mean, they had a society in ancient Buddhist culture. It was just a matter of, giving charity to the teachers, to the monks, and that's how the society survived. It wasn't, I will compensate you for what you do for me. And, we need a market economy to do that. So it would mean radical changes, to the way we live if we really went all the way. I'm not suggesting we need to go there. I'm just saying we need to realize that, what they're putting forth is not just describing the way, not just doing descriptive metaphysics. I mean, I think that has one implication for the current debate on personal identity. There's been an issue that people like David Shoemaker have discussed, which is, should the metaphysics guide the ethics, or should the ethics guide the metaphysics? And then, Maria Shetman, for example, says, these are the considerations, whatever answers to these, that's what a person is. These are the ethical considerations, or these are the normative considerations. And I think, the kind of approach I think that one needs to take there, and especially looking at the startling consequences if we take the revisionary metaphysics seriously, and sort of revisionary, the effect it would have on our practices, is to think of a kind of reflective equilibrium strategy. We do metaphysics and ethics together and try and see what is the best picture, but we kind of want to keep our ethical picture fixed. This is how we do it. And all of that is safe, even if there's something interesting about the Buddhist no self view. It is only restricted to, thinking about philosophy of mind. I don't think it's just that. That was not the Buddhist intention. They really wanted you to change. And so I think bringing some of that out is important. So that's one thing, I would want to say. Getting back to the question of, empirical psychology, and I mean, there is a lot of, no self kinds of views. In fact, I mean, at least giving up the big self, that's for sure. There is lots of things that we can cite in favor of that. And, Metzinger's work here, for example, is one way of doing that. But I think this is my sense, and I'd like to hear what, Evan and Owen think about this. I think that people give up on the metaphysical self, but people still keep a role for self-representations. Self-representations is not, that, or, some sense of self. That's not the dangerous thing. They can do, some of the work, self-models in Metzinger's way. People talk, like Tim Bain, my colleague, talks about virtual selves, no metaphysically heavy notion. Evan's notion of process selves, though, it's kind of, we can keep some of this to do the work. And I just think the Buddhist intention is kind of missed in this, because the real problem is the sense of self. That's what we need to get rid of. It's the ego, it's the sense of self. So we need to go deeper. So let's not try to save something like the sense of self. Rather than telling about my work, I'm bringing out controversial topics so people can enlighten me when I'm making mistakes. It's still work in progress, so.
I mean, this is great. This is really, really interesting to me. So Evan, Owen, whatever you want to add here.
Yeah, it's a really big topic that can be approached from a lot of different angles. I mean, one thing I would want to say just as a general remark is that, although there is, of course, the sort of canonical Buddhist idea of no self, if you actually look at what Buddhists say throughout the, 2000-year history in all the different cultures where Buddhism exists, you will find a variety of different views and uses of the term self and no self that in the Indian context are kind of in evolving dialectical exchange with their opponents philosophically, the what we today call the Hindu thinkers, the Brahminical thinkers, and then also the Jains. And I would say that from a certain perspective, if we just restrict our attention to the Indian context, the South Asian context, there is a sense in which all of the thinkers, with the exception of the materialists, naturalists, all of the thinkers think that we are mistaken in our sense of self and in our self-identification. And they all advocate a disidentification cognitive strategy. So, the Buddhists say, no state of the body or the mind at a time or over time is a self, where they mean an enduring subject of experience or an enduring agent of action. But the Brahminical thinkers would agree with that. They posit that there is a real self that transcends the body and the mind, but they think it's equally mistaken to identify with the body and mind as the self. So they're all in agreement on that. They then differ in the larger, you could say, soteriological kind of normative salvational framework of what would constitute full awakening. Is it, abandoning entirely any attachment to self, or is it realizing, the true nature of the self, which then gets, pegged as being different things as Indian philosophy evolves? And we even see in some traditions, say, Vedanta, where the pure self is identified with a kind of transcendent, transcendental witness consciousness that isn't, personal at all. We see an analogous idea in some forms of Buddhism that say there's an innate, pristine Buddha nature, and it's actually the self. So it's important, when we really dive into this topic, to get very specific about who we're talking about. Monima is working mainly from Vasubandhu, and Vasubandhu has a pretty hardcore view. As Monima said, there is no ultimately real self, there is no conventionally real self, there is no conventionally real person except as a figure of speech, you might say, but other than that, not. And he presents that on the basis of a really hardcore reductionist analysis of the psychophysical complex, and he runs into some really severe philosophical problems that his Hindu opponents immediately saddle him with, saying you can't account for memory, you can't account for karma, you can't account for if you do something bad, why there's going to be a negative karmic effect down the road that happens to you because you're the one who did something bad. Now, I mean, Vasubandhu has answers to this, but the philosopher's job is to go in and think about, are these good answers? Are they bad? What are their strong points? What are their weak points? And the amazing thing is the detail with which this gets argued out over centuries across, the different Indian philosophical thinkings. And since this is for the Brain blog, one thing I just want to mention, and then I'll pass it over to Owen, is a very, very developed and interesting debate about the binding problem centuries before Kant and centuries before cognitive science. Because the Hindu philosophers basically say to Vasubandhu, you can't account for the phenomenon of cognitive binding at a time and over time. You can't account for why the taste of the mango goes together with the color of the mango here and now, and how you can re-identify the mango in the next moment as something that you bit previously and you like the taste of and you're going to continue eating. You can't do this without a central orchestrating, principle of identity, which would be kind of like Kant's unity of apperception, that provides a ground for binding. You can't do that in a causal nominalist reductionist analysis. And Vasubandhu argues back and says, oh yes, I can, and proceeds to try to do it. And I'm not going to take sides on that debate here and now. I just want to call attention to the amazing sophistication of the debate long before we had Kant on the transcendental unity of apperception, and long before we had the cognitive science of the binding problem. So metaphysically and ethically, it's just an incredibly rich issue. But I guess my last comment is I would just stress that it spans the whole cosmopolitan context of Indian philosophy. It's not a strictly Buddhist issue, and I personally think it really needs to be seen in that larger dialectical context to really appreciate the depth of what's going on.
Yeah, anyone who wants to jump in now, yeah, be great.
Yeah, let me just make a few comments about this too, because it's such an exciting topic, and students are very interested in this, whether they're coming from the neuroscience side or the philosophy side. And what I found in my experience is that there are several different ways to sort of try to bring these issues to life with students. One is one I'm not very equipped to do, but both Evan and Monima would be equipped to do it. I mean, it's often said by real scholars of Buddhism, the things that both of them were saying about different traditions, about the conversation being for 2,000 years. It almost always is said by scholars who are in Buddhist studies and religion departments that the no self view is said against a certain, and now you got to fill in the blank, Brahmic view of self. And that's not right off the bat something that we, say, in the West are familiar with. And that gets you quickly down into some really exciting weeds, because both of these traditions, I mean, this is again a kind of a bias we have in Western philosophy, those of us who live in the footnotes to Plato lineage. We're at best only 1 billion out of 8 billion people on Earth. Most people didn't think up this stuff in the way exactly that we did. Okay, so there's a kind of scholarly respectfulness of going back and saying, okay, what exactly were the Buddhists saying that there's no self? What were they saying that in response to? That's one thing. The way that I tend to do it, both because I'm not that kind of, I'm not good at that kind of scholarship. I wasn't trained that way. I don't know the languages and so on and so forth. It's not sort of in my repertoire, is to approach it more the way both Monima and Evan were just suggesting, namely to say, okay, how could this way of thinking be valuable for us in our time as we think about how to think about persons, how to think about moral responsibility, how to think about ego, and the connections between them, the metaphysics and the ethics and the psychology are abundant. I mean, now, so given that as a background, I mean, one thing I can do with my students is just report on the fact that when I was a little boy, I learned that when I die, I go to heaven. And the question is, well, what part of me is the I that goes to heaven? And we know it's not my body because that would have died, decayed, and dispersed. It was me, the essence of me, and I'm there with, so you can, you know, I bring that in and then I get to say, well, and then I'd be there with my grandma, who I miss already, and so on and so forth. And this is a very, very important, widely shared set of cultural assumptions, or even if they're not shared as beliefs, they're often shared as desires. What could be better than for me to be back with my grandma? And so people get it, students can get it, but then you start to bring in things like, well, you know, there's other things in Buddhist metaphysics which say things like, well, everything's impermanent. Well, if everything's impermanent, and I'm one of the things that there are, things with quotes around it, then I am impermanent too. So what do sort of I add up to such that I could end up being a self-sustaining thingamajig? So I think it helps, it helps my students, again, the way we opened up the conversation about using models from other traditions to think about how to think about mind, brain, cognitive science. It just helps people to see a completely alternative system that thinks about, well, first of all, of course, Buddhists call the theory of salvation a soteriology. Sometime in Western traditions, we call it an eschatology, the story about what happens in the final, in the afterwards. These are all, so theories about what happens in the afterwards, if anything, something Evan is very interested in, been writing beautifully about, and still is writing about, apparently, from what he said at the beginning. Theories about that, about conscious desires to go on, to be reunited, for love to continue. These are powerful strands you see across different traditions, but they have very many different ways of working it out. You know, and you might say, of course, when I say to my students, well, yourself doesn't really go on, but there's reincarnation. And then you have to explain that in terms of Buddhist thing. And they don't find that very attractive, but of course, it's just like what if you tell a Buddhist, you get to go to heaven for all eternity. And they say, well, really? That doesn't sound And so I think, and then the one final thing I do want to say is that, and Monima is working on this, you know, we know in the Western tradition, Locke famously says, of course, that the concept of person is a forensic concept. It's all about its use in rewarding, blaming, holding people accountable practices. And I think, so what really is important is that a lot of theories about retribution and holding accountable maybe do depend more than we know, and there's good literature about this, about people writing against retributivism, on an account of persons that wouldn't sustain itself, or selves that doesn't sustain itself, either from the point of view of the best philosophical thinking or possibly the best cognitive science, neuroscience, sociological thinking.
Yeah, sorry, Monima, do you want to add anything before we?
Just one little thing, I guess. You know, I think, I mean, one way I like to think about what I do with the Buddhist texts, and I totally take Evans's point about, you know, there is many Buddhist thinkers with many Buddhist views. So I'm not making a claim about this is the Buddhist view. It's only a Buddhist view that I'm pursuing. But I think the approach I like to take is to treat that philosopher, you know, as a live figure, someone I'm interacting with, someone I'm trying to defend. So, you know, the problem that, you know, synchronic unity, diachronic unity, memory, you know, binding problem, all those are things are there. And all those things I've tried to, you know, look at very carefully and consider. If I may add, there's a paper that's just come out in the AJP about experiential unity. that I've done with Sean. It's just basically just telling about the history, about the, unity problems, and then saying what can be said about synchronic unity. So, I mean, that's kind of, I find that useful in teaching, and not taking what the tradition says as this is the final word, but, trying to teach them as live philosophers, and how would we interact with them? What are they telling us? Can we go that far? And so on and so forth. That's the approach I take. And I guess what you do in the classroom comes out in what you write. And so it will.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as someone who doesn't do history of philosophy myself, I mean, I enjoy it the most when it's, let's get the views on the table, and let's come up with active defenses and so forth. And I mean, if anything is a theme from what we've talked about today, it's just how relevant it is to all kinds of issues to do that with these traditions. Yeah, so I think that's a great place to kind of come to with that discussion, although we obviously could spend many hours discussing this particular point. But we're running short on time. So there's one thing I want to, and maybe we've already said a couple of things about this. There's a trend in neuroscience and psychology to actually study practitioners. So skilled meditators, Monima, you brought this up when thinking about, the concept issue. It's come up another, so in Owen's example of the not being startled by the gunshot. So I wanted to ask, so we've had a couple of examples. What do we think we learn about the mind, or about what can cognitive scientists learn specifically from studying people who are skilled practitioners in these ways? So Evan, I want to start with you because I know you've written a little bit about the neuroscience of these things.
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think, if you look at the kind of research that's being done, there's a variety of different kinds of research that are being done on meditation practices from the perspective of, say, cognitive neuroscience. Some of them look at long-term experienced meditators, Asian and Western. Some of them look at people who've done kind of secularized versions of various kinds of Buddhist mindfulness practices. That research is ongoing and interesting. I think the best, if I may, be bold to put it that way, I think the best of that research is research that combines, well-developed theoretical models and findings in cognitive science with well-developed theoretical models and concepts on the side of the meditation traditions, and works with people who are both experts or experienced, and also novices for, and people who have no experience for, the appropriate kinds of controls. And I'll give two examples where I think there's some very interesting research that's being done. So one example is on the perception and experience of pain. And this is a really interesting area because we have such well-developed, physiological and psychological models and findings about pain already. And it turns out that certain kinds of meditation practices that have to do with cultivating an open, non-selective, and unbiased awareness, rather than, say, a very specific focused kind of concentration, where you're, say, concentrating on your breath or a mantra or mental image or something like that, but rather a kind of practice where you have a certain kind of mental stability, where you might use the breath as an anchor, but really the point of the practice is just non-distraction and alertness in the present moment to whatever arises. It turns out that that mental set is associated with significant reductions, and now I'm talking in expert practitioners, with significant reductions in the self-reported unpleasantness of pain for pain stimuli, with increased sensory discriminatory accuracy for the pain stimulus, with a correlated reduction in activities in neural areas that are associated with cognitive and affective aspects of pain. So, sort of approach, avoid, aversive type responses or cognitive elaborations, like, here comes that pain again. This is the kind of pain I had when, my tooth was pulled, the kind of mental elaboration stuff, that you see a significant reduction in brain, areas associated with these kinds of cognitive processes, or brain networks, I should really say, associated with these kinds of affective, cognitive, elaborative processes, with accurate sensory discrimination and significantly less self-reported unpleasantness. So what this speaks to is how certain kinds of mental sets that are cultivated in certain styles of meditation practice can have, very significant effects on perception and experience for body stimulation, for pain. And that opens up, on the therapeutic side, new possibilities for, cognitive strategies for dealing with pain, especially in cases of, say, chronic pain where, they're not well treated, pharmacologically. So that's one area where, because we have such well-developed science already for pain, and now we have these new kinds of individuals we can study, we're finding out some very interesting things. And it's related to actually what we were talking about earlier in terms of concept formation, because one hypothesis is that they're actually kind of taking offline that categorization and conceptualization of it as, affective cognitive pain, and just responding to the sensory particularity in the moment of that stimulus. So we can connect it to philosophical theories in Buddhism as well. Then the second example I'll mention, and this is also something I've written about, is metacognition, specifically meta-awareness, the idea that you can be aware or become aware of ongoing mental processes and cognitive contents in a way that seems to be, and I'm speaking now of these same kinds of open awareness meditation practices, in a way that seems to be procedural and non-conceptual, which isn't really a kind of metacognition that we've theorized very well so far. Because in the models of metacognition, it's basically, you have a kind of global workspace architecture, and you can meta represent contents in the global, that are being globally broadcast, and you represent them, propositionally for the most part. And so the idea that there's a different kind of, what Joël Proust has written about this, kind of procedural, non-conceptual metacognition based around certain feelings of know-how, noetic feelings of know-how. This is something that seems to be specifically trained in certain styles of meditation practice, these open awareness styles, where you can initially develop your attention in relationship to an anchor like the breath, but then you can drop it and have an open posture of awareness of, you could say, awareness and its qualities itself, but without objectifying it or making it into an object, through this non-propositional form of meta-awareness. So, that's something that is very complicated to study, because you need people who are familiar with these meditation practices. You need scholars who understand, the sort of textual tradition around these meditation practices, because they're not talked about in the philosophical literature very much. And you need scientists who, are experts on metacognition, and you need people who are familiar with the kind of evolving cognitive science discussions of this. So it's kind of like an edge of research that's in process, where the Buddhist, practice tradition and intellectual tradition, I think is really important and relevant. And so I'll just end by saying what I've really tried to stress here is that this is not neural correlates of meditation research, in the sense where you take, someone and you put them in a scanner and you see what lights up. Like, that's not interesting research. I mean, no cognitive neuroscientist thinks that's interesting research for anything anyway. But the idea that it would be good for meditation, that's just like not how to do it, right? You need theory-driven research and hypothesis-driven research, but the theories are informed by the practice traditions and intellectual traditions of the host, Buddhist cultures, and that's what's exciting about it as a cross-cultural cognitive science.
Awesome. Yeah. Go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, just following up on what Evan just said. I thought Evan just put it beautifully. And that you want theory-driven research where you actually have precision on both sides, namely you have some kind of good physical model, brain model, you know a lot about the systems that are probably in play. You then have these very rigorously specified practices. And in addition, this is something Evan would say, I don't think he just said it now though, is that there are actually very clear predictions, you might say, in the literature, the Buddhist literatures, about what mental states you will actually go into if you do such and so. So notice what you can do is what Evan called neurophenomenology. You can actually make sure that you're getting mappings, not just by looking for neural correlates, but that you're reliably getting actually the phenomenological reports that are predicted in these particular texts and going along. And the pain work is a brilliant idea. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, because it's fairly well understood, some of the issues, we have some hypotheses about what is implicated. So the area of mind, body medicine, I think, and therapy is a very good area. One thing one has to watch out for here is that, I mean, the one problem with Buddhist modernism, about which both Evan and I have written, and there's some elements of it in which are peculiar. So for example, a lot of the claims about, for example, meditation are, are basically, well, there's an industry of antecedently well-off white people in yoga outfits doing things that make themselves feel subsequently even better about themselves than they did before. Now, this is not incorporating, going against your egoism. It's not getting over yourself. In fact, it's the opposite. But there's an industry that is monetizing that industry that makes claims about it that are bullshit in the technical sense. But they're abundant, and they sometimes will make claims about what's going on in your body, as it were. So this isn't, as it were, the tradition's fault. It's the fault of snake oil salesmen, which arrive at any time there's a new something. But I think that really rigorous work can be done. Other work that I had that Evan didn't mention that I at least remember I admired when I read about it. There's some work on cortisol levels. That's something which is associated with stress. It can be tracked fairly reliably. We have some good theory about it. There's some evidence that you see reductions in cortisol depletion from the adrenal glands over the course of a day for people who are engaged in certain kind of practices. That's good for cardiovascular health and things like that. So, bit by bit, zone by zone, one can study these things. I guess one hypothesis that didn't turn out too well, but it wasn't well enough theorized at the beginning. In the early 2000s, there was research indicating that very experienced meditators not only had greater activity in left prefrontal cortex, but that was also associated with greater equanimity or happiness or calm. And that people don't talk about that much anymore. And I think there's reasons behind it, but it was good. It was done by good people trying to follow a hunch. So.
Let me just, perhaps one little thing to add there is, I think, those examples that both of you have given are absolutely brilliant. And that's how the work needs to be done rather than looking for correlates. But my sense by looking at this literature is that there's more work that needs to be done in understanding the Buddhist model of mind. There is a lot of, sort of work there, I think, thinking about how they think the mind works. And there's lots of gaps in that literature, I think, in the theory on the Buddhist side. And I think that's where some of the work, because people are quite, and maybe that's okay for a start, selective in picking up the concepts that they can theorize about, because you need, as I think Owen rightly put it, theories on both sides to be pretty strong before you can do any useful work. But I find the theories on the Buddhist side are a bit weak at the moment and could do with more serious work thinking about the mind as a whole.
Yeah, that's awesome and really helpful. I mean, this is becoming a trope at this point, but inevitably in these discussions, because we collect a interdisciplinary audience at the Brains blog, one of the things that always emerges is like the opportunities, but also the challenges of really doing really good interdisciplinary work, right? Because you need to be able to actually have, in this case, good theory on the cognitive side, but also respect for and well-articulated understanding of what the actual traditions are saying is happening in these cases. So yeah, I think it's another great example of that. We've, to be frank, we've kind of blown past time, but I found this conversation so interesting that I didn't want to curtail it any more than I was already doing. The last thing I was going to ask about, and Owen, actually, you kind of broached on this a little bit anyway, was just kind of like philosophers' role in public discourse surrounding Buddhism. So, as we've all mentioned, it's something that students are interested in. It's something that there's whole industries, or at least aspects of Buddhist theory or practice, there's kind of whole industries built around it. So just briefly, kind of as a conclusion, are there specific things that you all see as roles for philosophers in the kind of public discourse surrounding Buddhism and the mind? Owen, I was going to ask you to start. You kind of brushed on it a bit anyway. Is there anything you want to add? And then we'll just take everyone's kind of last thoughts on this.
Let me see if I could add anything helpful. So yes, I think we're in a good time for Buddhist studies in general because of the cultural interest in Buddhism. That's partly due to probably, we can't underestimate the importance of the current Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, who just passed away. These are very, very important, visible cultural figures. So one can't, sort of guarantee that the enthusiasm, it's having its moment. I think last I read, I think there are 500 million Buddhists on Earth out of 8 billion people. So that would come out to 1 in 16 people on Earth. It's not nearly the size of other great world religions or, traditions, but of course it is one of the important traditions that came out of India, the Indian subcontinent, along with Jainism and other small religion, which also has wonderful philosophical theories in it. It's having its moment, and I think one of the nice things about, at least, I think this is true of modern multicultural universities that all of us in this room teach at, we do have students who are from all over the world, and they will be the generation that grows up in global internationalist cities where not everybody, where I grew up, although I was near New York when I grew up, there were only Irish Catholics, I was one of them, Italian Catholics, and Jews. There were 3 kinds of people. I even thought Hispanics until I was 15 were Puerto Ricans, because those are the only Hispanics I ever met in New York. So the world is different. And I think what's wonderful now is that students are aware of the great diversity of ways to be human and the ways to think about the human condition. So I'm delighted to have lived long enough to be at the point where it's acceptable in modern universities to talk about these great wisdom traditions, which have so much to teach us.
Awesome, cool. Evan, Monima, last thoughts before we head off?
Go ahead, Monima.
Yeah.
Well, I think Owen has summed it up nicely. We are fortunate to be, living in this time where universities, our colleagues, take the work which we want to do seriously. And, there is an interest in the university, because I think at the public outreach of an academic, seriously in the classroom, everything else, to my mind, is not, It's corrupting the minds. If we can corrupt young minds, we've done our job. Philosophers.
Great. Okay, and then, see, I almost feel like we should end there. That sounds great to me, but Evan, why don't you bring us
No,
on home here?
I mean, I agree. I don't really want to take away from that. I mean, maybe if it's just about public outreach, I guess I would just emphasize, in keeping with what everybody else has said, that, you know, since we're philosophers, you know, our role is to encourage people, you know, to think deeply and to think critically about what really matters. And that's never been more needed than it is now in our world. And at the same time, you know, we've never had more availability of the world's traditions for doing that, and, you know, more, you know, multicultural communities in which we're doing that. And, you know, I would just encourage all of us as philosophers, you know, to keep that spirit of intellectual inquiry alive, and to, you know, encourage students, because especially if it's undergraduate students, you know, this is the only time in their life when they're going to be able to do this. If they go on to, you know, whatever job they go on to, you know, some of them will go to graduate school and specialize in this, but they're a very small number. So this is the time in their life where we can, you know, really encourage them to think, you know, deeply about these things. And then in our public outreach, I think it's very important to present, you know, the philosophical perspective. I think especially with the science of meditation, it's very important to present the philosophical perspective, because we emphasize science so heavily in our culture, and there are good reasons we do that. But science has philosophical assumptions and works with, you know, philosophical conceptions and makes philosophical inferences all the time. And that really needs to be, you know, constantly repeated publicly in ways that people can connect to. And it's very important in this area of new research.
Awesome, great, thank you so much. And in conclusion, corrupt the youth. That's what we're
And corrupt the youth, yes, always.
Always and everywhere.
At all times, everywhere, yes.
All right, so we have to stop. Thank you all so much. This was such a pleasure. I learned a ton. I'm worried about how I'm going to give my talk on non-conceptual content in a couple days without totally. So I'm corrupted anyway. But that was such a pleasure. Thank you all so much for doing this, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. Please join us for future iterations of Brains Blog Roundtables. Thanks.